The youngest heir of the Lionel family pretended to be poor on a blind date to test his potential girlfriend, and the reactions of the women left him surprised. In this unexpected romance, he learned a valuable lesson. Determined to find someone who loved him for who he truly was, not for his immense fortune, this meeting was more than just a blind date, it was a test. After witnessing too many eyes light up at the mention of the Lionel family's wealth, he wanted to know, would anyone love him simply for himself, without the prestige that came with his name? Lionel smiled faintly as he caught his reflection in a small roadside mirror. Gone were the designer suits and expensive watches. Today, he was just an ordinary man in a worn-out shirt, faded jeans, and scuffed shoes. No luxury car, no bodyguards, no titles. You're watching from Today, and if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe. The meeting took place in a rundown cafe on the outskirts of London, an unlikely place for someone like Lionel to be seen. The first woman was Charlotte, a haughty socialite from the affluent Mayfair district. With golden blonde hair and expensive high heels, she sat down, gave Lionel a quick once-over, and immediately asked, "What do you do for a living?" I'm a delivery driver," Lionel replied, deliberately hesitating. "I ride a bicycle around the city, making a few pounds a day." Charlotte frowned, her crimson lips pressing together. "A delivery driver? On a bicycle? You must be joking. What was my family thinking, setting me up with someone like this?" She shot up from her seat, flung her designer bag over her shoulder with disdain, and stormed off without a second glance. Lionel took a sip of tea, smiling faintly, but inside, a trace of disappointment lingered. The second woman was Isabella, an Italian model who had graced the Milan runways. With her mesmerizing blue eyes and a voice as smooth as silk, she listened to Lionel's delivery driver story without immediately leaving. Instead, she tilted her head and asked, "Do you at least have your own apartment? Or maybe a decent car?" When Lionel shook his head, explaining that he only rented a tiny room in East End and rode an old bicycle, Isabella sighed. "I don't date men with no future," she said coolly before rising from her seat, leaving behind only the lingering scent of Chanel. The next meetings were no better. A Parisian woman scoffed when he mentioned that he had once slept in a park because he couldn't afford rent. Another woman from Los Angeles bluntly asked, "If you're this poor, how are you going to buy me a Gucci bag?" Lionel began to wonder if true love even existed in this world, or if everything was just a cleverly disguised transaction. And then he met Sophie. She entered the cafe with a surprisingly simple look, an oversized gray sweater, wide-leg pants, and a pair of faded canvas shoes. No makeup, no jewelry, just her neatly tied brown hair and a warm smile that immediately caught Lionel's attention. When he told her his delivery driver story, Sophie didn't seem bothered in the slightest. Instead, she nodded and asked, "Riding a bike around must be exhausting, huh? With all the rain in London, do you get sick often?" Lionel was stunned. For the first time, someone cared about him, or rather, the poor version of him, without any regard for wealth or status. He chuckled and replied, "I've gotten used to it. Don't you think I'm too poor?" Sophie shrugged, her voice gentle. "What's so bad about being poor? What matters is that you're a good person who tries his best. I don't need a rich boyfriend, just someone who's honest with me." Her words were like a warm breeze melting the ice around Lionel's heart. He decided to test her further. "What if I told you I still owe money for a bike repair? Would that bother you?" he asked, trying to hide his nervousness. Sophie laughed, her eyes sparkling. "Debts can be repaid, as long as you don't run away from them. I'm not exactly well off either. Wouldn't it be better if two people worked hard together?" Lionel felt his heart pound. He looked at Sophie and realized she wasn't just different, she was the hope he had been searching for. But he wasn't ready to reveal the truth just yet. He needed to be sure. The next day, Lionel invited Sophie to dinner. He chose a cheap street-side eatery, ordering 2 plates of fried fish and chips for less than £10. As he watched her anxiously, Sophie ate happily, even chatting about the days when she worked as a bartender to pay for her tuition. "This is really good. It's been a while since I've eaten so comfortably," she said, completely unbothered. The true test came on their third date. Lionel pretended to be in trouble, claiming his bicycle chain had broken and that he needed to borrow money for repairs. Without hesitation, Sophie rummaged through her bag and pulled out a few crumpled bills, everything she had, and handed them to him. "Here, take this. If it's not enough, let me know, and I'll borrow some for my friends," she said sincerely, her kindness making Lionel's throat tighten with emotion. He couldn't hide it any longer. Lionel took Sophie's hands, looked her straight in the eye, and confessed, "I'm not a delivery driver. I'm Lionel, heir to the Lionel family. I pretended to be poor to find someone who truly loves me, and I've found you." Sophie froze, her eyes widening in shock. But instead of the joy he had expected, she pulled her hands away, her voice trembling. "You lied to me. Why didn't you tell me the truth from the start? I don't need your money, but I hate being tested like some kind of game." Panic surged through Lionel. "I didn't mean any harm, Sophie. I just needed to be sure. I'm sorry. I love you, not for any other reason, just for who you are." The air between them grew tense. Sophie remained silent for a long time, her expression wavering between anger and emotion. Finally, she sighed and said, "If you want me to believe you, then from now on, never lie to me again. I don't care if you're rich or poor, I just want you to be yourself." Lionel nodded, silent tears rolling down his cheeks. He knew he had found the woman meant for him, not through wealth or power, but through the sincerity of both their hearts. After Lionel promised never to deceive Sophie again, their relationship blossomed, simple, yet meaningful. Slowly, he revealed his true life to her, not through lavish parties or luxury cars, but through stories of the immense responsibilities he carried as the Lionel heir. Sophie listened, sometimes surprised, but never overwhelmed or intimidated. She remained the same, still calling him "my Lionel," instead of "the Lionel heir." That only made him love her more, but it also made him afraid. When faced with the harsh realities of high society, would Sophie be able to keep her pure heart intact? Things became complicated when Lionel's family discovered Sophie. His mother, Eleanor, a powerful woman with piercing eyes and an air of nobility, refused to accept their relationship. To her, Sophie was nothing more than a common girl from a poor marketplace district, uneducated, of no noble lineage, and utterly unworthy of the Lionel heir. One stormy afternoon, Eleanor summoned Lionel to the family estate in Kensington. As he stepped inside, she wasted no time getting to the point. "I heard you've been seeing a waitress. Are you trying to make a fool of our family in front of London's elite, Lionel?" Lionel clenched his fists, his voice firm. "She's not a joke. She's the only person who loves me for who I am, not for my money or status." Eleanor scoffed, her eyes filled with disdain. "Love? Don't be naive, my son. She will change once she realizes you can give her the world. And I will prove it to you." Eleanor wasted no time in executing her plan. She secretly hired a private investigator to dig into Sophie's past, searching for any weaknesses that could be used to drive a wedge between her and Lionel. Soon, an unexpected secret was uncovered. Sophie had once accumulated a large debt during her university years when she borrowed money to pay for her mother's medical treatment, her mother, who had passed away years ago. Though Sophie had been repaying the debt little by little, the accumulating interest remained a heavy burden she kept hidden. The investigator also found something suspicious. A strange man had been lurking near Sophie's home lately, presumably a debt collector hunting her down. Eleanor didn't let the opportunity slip away. She secretly contacted the creditor, offering him a large sum in advance to stage a setup. He would corner Sophie and force her to beg Lionel for help, proving that she was just like the other gold diggers. The creditor readily agreed, and the plan was set in motion. On a stormy evening, as Lionel and Sophie were having dinner in her small apartment, a loud, urgent knock sounded at the door. Sophie paled as she opened it and saw a tall, scar-faced man standing there with a sinister grin. "Sophie, did you think you could hide forever? Where's my money? 20,000 pounds. Pay up tonight, or else," he bellowed, making sure to cause a scene in front of Lionel. Lionel shot to his feet, ready to intervene, but Sophie stopped him, her voice trembling. "Don't, Lionel. This is my problem." She turned to the man, trying to stay calm. "I'll pay, but I need more time." "Time? Do I look like an idiot?" The creditor sneered, then glanced at Lionel. "Ah, so this is your golden ticket. Why not ask him? Word is, he's loaded." Sophie turned back to Lionel, her eyes brimming with tears. "Leave, Lionel. I don't want you involved in this," she choked out. But Lionel didn't move. He stepped forward, facing the creditor head-on. "How much? I'll pay right now." The man smirked, exchanging a knowing glance with Sophie as if the plan had succeeded. But then something no one expected happened. Sophie shoved Lionel away and screamed, "No! I don't want your money. I'd rather go to jail than have you think I love you for your wealth." She lunged at the creditor, snatching the debt contract from his hands, and tore it to pieces in front of both men. Lionel was stunned, while the creditor panicked. "You crazy woman! You think ripping that up makes the debt disappear? I'll sue you," he roared. But Lionel had already regained his composure. He pulled out his phone, dialed his assistant, and spoke calmly. "Handle him. I want him out of London by morning." Minutes later, a group of men in black suits appeared, silently dragging the screaming creditor away. When the door shut behind them, Lionel turned to Sophie, who had collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. He knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Sophie, I didn't offer to pay because I thought you needed money. I did it because I don't want to lose you." Sophie looked up, her eyes red and puffy. "You don't understand, Lionel. Your mother will hate me even more now. I don't belong in your world." At that moment, the doorbell rang again. Both of them tensed, fearing the creditor had returned. But when Lionel opened the door, standing there was Eleanor, her face cold, but her eyes carrying something unreadable. She stepped inside, looking at the trembling Sophie, and then to their shock, she spoke. "I was wrong." Lionel and Sophie froze. Eleanor continued, her voice low but filled with an emotion they had never heard before. "I orchestrated all of this to test you, Sophie. I wanted to prove you were just like the others. But you tore up the easiest way out of debt just to protect your love. I've never seen anyone like you in this world full of deception." She walked up to Sophie, placed a hand on her shoulder, and said, "If you truly love my son, I won't stand in your way anymore. But promise me one thing, never let him be as lonely as I once was in this family." Sophie nodded, tears streaming down her face, while Lionel pulled her into a tight embrace, feeling a weight lift from his heart. But the story didn't end there. As Eleanor turned to leave, she placed an envelope on the table. Lionel picked it up and found a document inside, a contract transferring 10% of the Lionel Corporation shares to Sophie. Beneath it was a single note. "If she is worthy, let her share your burden." Lionel turned to Sophie, his expression a mix of surprise and concern. "What will you do with this?" he asked. Sophie smiled softly, took the paper, and gently tore it in half before his eyes. "I don't need it, Lionel. I just need you." But at that very moment, from a dark corner of the street outside, a figure silently observed. The lone shark had somehow escaped the bodyguards, and in his hand was a phone recording everything. He whispered, "You think it's over? I'll make sure all of London knows the secrets of this family." After Lady Eleanor acknowledged Sophie and left the apartment with a promise not to interfere in their love anymore, Lionel and Sophie thought they had finally found peace. Lionel decided to gradually withdraw from the heavy responsibilities of his family to live a simpler life with Sophie. He sold part of his private assets and bought a small house in the countryside of Cotswolds, where the green fields stretched endlessly, and the air was fresh, far from the noise of London. Sophie adapted quickly. She planted a small vegetable garden, worked part-time at a local bakery, and every evening, she and Lionel sat by the fireplace, sharing little stories from their day. Their life felt like a simple dream, but that dream didn't last forever. One winter morning, while Lionel was fixing the wooden fence around their home, a delivery truck stopped in front of the gate. The driver stepped out, handing him a package with no sender's name. Curious, Lionel opened it and turned pale. Inside was an old, tattered leather notebook and a small note with a handwritten message. "You can't run forever, Lionel. This secret will find you." He flipped through the notebook, and each page made his heart pound. It was the diary of his father, Edward Lionel, who had died in a mysterious car accident 10 years ago. But the most terrifying part was the final entry. "I know the truth about my accident. If I die, find the woman named Rose in Edinburgh. She holds the key." Lionel had never heard of Rose, and his father's death had always been considered a random accident by the family. But this diary suggested something horrific. His father may have been murdered, and whoever was behind it was still watching him. He hid the notebook in his pocket, not wanting to worry Sophie, but his eyes couldn't mask his unease. Sophie noticed immediately. "You're hiding something from me, Lionel," she said gently but firmly. Unable to keep it a secret, Lionel told her everything. Sophie was silent for a moment, then took his hand and said, "If this is true, we have to find Rose. I don't want you to live your life in fear." Lionel hesitated. He didn't want to drag Sophie into danger, but the determination in her eyes made him nod. They packed their bags and boarded a night train to Edinburgh, beginning their search for the truth. In Edinburgh, they followed the vague clues from the diary to an old pub called the Red Stag, a place his father had mentioned. As they stepped inside, a heavy tension filled the air. Curious glances from the regulars, whispers dying down as they took their seats. Lionel asked the bartender about Rose, and an old man with silver hair stepped forward. "Rose isn't here anymore," he said, his voice hoarse. "But if you're Edward's son, I have something for you." The old man led them down to the basement, where a dusty wooden box was hidden behind stacks of whiskey barrels. Inside was a handwritten letter from Rose and a silver ring engraved with the initials E&R. The letter told a story that made Lionel freeze in shock. Rose had once been Edward's secret lover before he married Lady Eleanor. When Rose became pregnant, Edward wanted to leave his family to be with her, but the Lionel family had stopped him. At the end of the letter, Rose wrote, "Edward told me that if he died, it wouldn't be an accident. Protect our child, and don't let the family find them." Lionel was stunned. He might have a half-sibling, a secret the family had buried for years. Sophie held him tightly and whispered, "We'll find them, Lionel. You're not alone anymore." But at that moment, the basement light suddenly flickered off, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the stairs. A cold voice spoke. "You shouldn't have come here, Lionel." From the shadows, a man emerged, tall, dressed in a black suit, with sharp, angular features and piercing eyes. He introduced himself as James, a problem solver for the Lionel family. "Your mother sent me to make sure this secret never gets out. Rose died 5 years ago, but her child is still alive. If you want them to stay safe, hand over the diary and leave." Lionel clenched his fists, his voice shaking with rage. "My mother knew about this? What did she do to my father?" James smirked. "She didn't kill him, but she let him die. A perfect liste à jet d'accident. Now, give me the diary, or I'll take it from your corpse." The air was thick with tension. Then, unexpectedly, Sophie spoke up, her voice calm and composed. "You want the diary? Here." She pulled a notebook from her coat pocket, the fake one she had prepared in secret on the train. James snatched it, flipped through a few pages, then nodded. "Smart move. Now leave and forget about this." When James left, Lionel looked at Sophie, his eyes filled with both astonishment and gratitude. "When did you do that?" he asked. Sophie smiled. "Ever since you told me. I knew we had to protect the truth, not for revenge, but to find your brother." They returned to the pub and persuaded the old man to reveal Rose's child's whereabouts. He sighed and handed them an address in the Scottish Highlands. "His name is Callum. He's 25 and lives in seclusion. But be careful, the Lionel family isn't the only one looking for him." With the address in hand, Lionel and Sophie set off for the Scottish Highlands, a vast, mist-covered land with winding roads cutting through dense pine forests. On the rickety bus ride through fields of purple heather, Lionel held Sophie's hand tightly, his gaze heavy with emotion. "If Callum really is my brother, I don't know how to face him," he admitted in a low voice. "I grew up in luxury. But what about him? A life on the run." Sophie squeezed his hand and smiled gently. "No matter who Callum is, you're the brother he never knew he had. We're not here to make amends, we're here to bring the truth." They arrived at a small village nestled deep in the valley, where only a handful of gray stone houses and an abandoned church stood. The address led them to a rickety wooden cabin on the village's outskirts, its windows covered in dust, smoke curling from the chimney. When Lionel knocked, a young man opened the door, tall and lean, his dark, unkempt hair and striking blue eyes an exact replica of their father's in old photographs. It was Callum. He eyed them with a mix of wariness and curiosity. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice slightly hoarse from the cold. Lionel took a deep breath and with a shaky voice, said, "I'm Lionel. I'm your brother. Our father was Edward Lionel." Callum froze, his grip tightening on the doorframe until his knuckles turned white. He said nothing, only turned away and stepped inside. Inside, the cabin was so sparse it made Sophie's heart ache. A single worn-out bed, a scratched wooden table, and a few hand-drawn sketches pinned to the wall. All of them were of a middle-aged man Lionel immediately recognized as their father. Callum sat down, his voice cold. "My mother, Rose, told me about him. She said he wanted to protect me, but then he died, and all I had left were empty promises." Lionel pulled the diary from his coat and placed it on the table. "Our father left this behind. He knew he might be killed, and he wanted us to find you." Callum flipped through the pages, his eyes gradually turning red. When he reached the final words, "Protect our child," silent tears slipped onto the wooden table. "I always thought I was abandoned," Callum whispered. Your mother, what did she do to our father?" The question struck Lionel like a knife. He didn't know how to answer, but Sophie spoke, her voice warm and steady. "We're not here to place blame, Callum. We're here to heal. Lionel gave up so much to find you, and I believe you deserve to know the truth." The air was thick with emotion. Finally, Callum walked to the corner of the cabin and retrieved a small box his mother had left behind. Inside were letters Edward had written to Rose, words of love, apologies, and a plan to escape that was never realized. The last letter contained a detail that left them all in shock. "If I can't be with you and Callum, take him to the house in the Lake District. I've left everything there for you both." Lionel turned to Callum. "Have you ever been to the Lake District?" Callum shook his head. "My mother never spoke of it. She only told me to hide, to stay low, because your family would never let me go." The decision was immediate. Together, they would travel to the Lake District to find Edward's secret house. During the journey, they slowly opened up. Callum shared stories of working on farms to survive, while Lionel confessed how he had once despised his own family's hypocrisy. Sophie became their bridge, gently encouraging them to connect. When they arrived, the house stood before them, a small stone cottage by the shore of Lake Windermere, hidden behind towering oak trees. Inside, everything was coated in dust, yet the warmth of a home remained. Family photos, old books, and a small safe embedded in the floor. Callum found the key inside his mother's box, and when they opened the safe, they discovered a large sum of money and Edward's final letter. Lionel, Callum, if you're reading this, please forgive me. This money is for you to live free, unshackled from the family. Take care of each other. For the first time, the two brothers embraced, their tears carrying years of loss and longing. But the moment was shattered by the distant roar of engines. Through the window, they saw 3 black SUVs pulling up, the unmistakable sign of the Lionel family. Lady Eleanor stepped out. She no longer looked as cold as before. Instead, her face was etched with exhaustion and regret. "I know you're here," she said, her voice heavy. "I haven't come to stop you. I've come to say I'm sorry." She recounted how, after Lionel left, she had gone through Edward's old documents and realized that it was her own control that had unknowingly pushed him toward his death. "I don't want to lose another child," she said, looking at Callum with deep regret. "If you wish, you may return to the family. If not, I will let you go free." Lionel and Callum exchanged a glance before clasping Sophie's hand together. "We choose freedom," Lionel said firmly. "But we forgive you, Mother." Lady Eleanor nodded, silent tears slipping down her face, a rare moment of vulnerability she had never allowed herself before. Back at the Grand Lionel estate, she sat alone in the vast drawing room, where portraits of their ancestors lined the towering walls. For years, she had believed that power and prestige were the ties that bound a family together. But now, watching her 3 children walk away, she understood, those ties had only shackled them for too long. She closed her eyes, allowing the last of her tears to fall, her aged face weighed down by loneliness. As Lionel, Callum, and Sophie stepped beyond the great iron gates of the Lionel estate, they felt as if they had finally cast off a burden that had weighed on them for years. They did not look back. There was too much ahead of them, and for the first time, they truly felt they had the right to shape their own destinies. Years later, after building a life and family of his own, Lionel unexpectedly received a package. It wasn't money or an inheritance, it was an old diary belonging to Lady Eleanor. "I once believed that power was the only way to protect my family, but in the end, it was what made me lose the ones I loved most. By the time you read this, I may no longer be here. But I hope that, at least this time, I have made the right choice, the choice to set you free." Lionel closed the diary and sat in silence for a long time. He wasn't sure if he could ever completely forgive her. But he knew one thing, Lady Eleanor had finally understood. And perhaps, that was the only redemption she could offer.